Welcome to this interview with Professor Dr. Trevor Tebbs. Trevor Tebbs is an international educator who received his initial training and experience in the United Kingdom. He attended Bristol University, where he studied special education. He taught children of all ages in regular and special education settings. While vice president of a special school, he compiled a text entitled Ways and Means, a research book for teachers of language disorder children, and it is published by Macmillan in 1978. In the United States, he has worked as a freelance artist, a college art professor, a special educator, an art teacher, and an enrichment coordinator. An increasing interest in giftedness led Trevor Tebbs to study educational psychology with an emphasis on giftedness and counseling with Joseph Renzulli and his team at the National Research Center on the Gifted and Talented, based at the University of Connecticut, Yukon. While at Yukon, he worked with older gifted highly able individuals as assistant director of the honors program. Since that time, he has taught prospective educators in various university and college education and psychology departments, where he enjoys teaching various courses, including seminars in giftedness. Trevor has become involved with a number of international institutions and networks, including the International Center for Innovation in Education, ICIE, and the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children as an assistant editor of the Council's journal, Gifted and Talented International, and our journal, the International Journal for Talent Development and Creativity. In addition, he developed a new system to identify the potentially gifted students and authored a large number of research papers, articles, and monographs. The International Center for Innovation in Education is very pleased to meet with Trevor Tebbs. So you are more than welcome now.
Well, good morning, Tassir. It's really lovely to see you again. And knowing that you're in Germany, I'm here in Vermont. We've shared so many things over, how many years? 25 years, quarter of a century. So we know each other very well. Others who may be listening in to this conversation may not know quite as much as we do of each other. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background. People who are listening carefully will recognize an English accent, which is, quite right. I am English, but I've been living in Vermont for now 35 years. And I suspect I still have a lot of that Englishness in my veins, especially in terms of how I was trained as an educator over 50 years ago.
Yes.
It was at a time when there was a lot of emphasis on holistic education, where kids were educated more towards their interests and their passions than just strictly a grade average, as they typically are today. And I think my education in England was very valuable in that respect, particularly in terms of how we now regard the best ways of teaching and working with children in a population of our children's population. My education was very much to do with how to teach and the psychological partnership between issues that were very much to do with feelings and social emotional issues, passion and motivation, as it was to do with learning. And I think that's really what motivates me still, is the idea that pedagogy and psychology is inseparable. They are both so important. So when I am working with my children as an educational psychologist here in Vermont, I am really looking at both aspects. I'm not just looking at, who they are just as a single person who may be a unit in a classroom that either is successful or a failure. I'm really looking at them to see whether they are successful in terms of happy and satisfied and motivated. And that's the reason why moms and dads often come and see me in my clinic, is because their child is not happy and satisfied. They're really struggling and most miserable. Just this past week, I had a teenager come to see me, Tasia, and because of the virus, we actually had to meet round a campfire in the back of our garden, which made it all the more memorable. But he sat next to me, burst into tears, and admitted he really would like to commit suicide, which is a horrendous thing to even contemplate. And you're thinking, well, this is not a happy child. So what is going on? And in the last few weeks before this conversation, Tasia, I've had 4 or 5 young people who haven't been quite that blatant with respect to what they want to do, but nevertheless, a young 10-year-old whose mother said, well, last time I saw him, he was just lying on the floor in great floods of tears, saying, what's the point? What's the point? There's no point in what I'm doing at school. I don't like it, etc., etc. So and I know that young man, that 10-year-old in particular, he's been accelerated 2 years above his grade. And even in kindergarten, he was reading almost 8, 9, 10-year-old level. So I know he has many skills and abilities. I've heard him speak. He can command the attention of adults. He has an enormous ability to be empathetic towards his classmates and the world besides. He wants to solve the problems of the world. But somehow, suddenly, he's in tears. So here's the connection between what they are able to do, what they want to do, what's inside them that allows them to be someone to be reckoned with in the world, but a psychological issue that actually depresses that capacity. And those are the 2 things that I find fascinating. So if I get a parent coming to visit with me, first of all, I ask the parent, tell me the story. What is it why are you here? And they'll very often tell me that, well, we've been looking for help and guidance with our child. He's not, or she is not feeling happy. She's not working. She's coming home, feeling depressed, not wanting to do anything. And that's not really who we know she is. So what is going on at school? Well, they're bored. That is often what I hear. And I said, well, what's the teacher like that is working with the child? Well, she doesn't believe in giftedness. She doesn't believe that a child is any different. She believes that it needs to observe the class structure. She needs to know that there are times when has to sort of do what we're asking her to do, and there are times when they're being asked to do things that they already did 2-3 years ago. And the parents say, look, you know, my child's coming back saying, look, I haven't learned anything today. So when they come for help, we have to look at ways in which we can, first of all, I always try and look at ways in which we can help the teacher better understand the child. I don't immediately come up with plan B and say, look, take them out or go homeschool. I do like to see if there's a way in which we can work with the teacher, help the teacher understand the needs of the child, both psychological and academic, educational. I like to give the teachers a chance, because it actually, apart from perhaps being a benefit to the child, it actually may actually be a benefit to many children. Not just the child we're dealing with in the clinical situation. And that requires, as far as I'm concerned, a holistic assessment. You know, what is going on in the teacher's mind? What is going on in the parent's mind? What's going on in the child's mind? Because then when you triangulate that information, what you get is a better, clearer picture of what the issues are, which you can then perhaps begin to actually address. I also like to find out what the personality is of a child, because I think that is so valuable. Given, I don't know how it is in Germany, Tasia, but in America, and I believe in England, 85% of teachers in elementary school, for instance, or junior school, you know, up to 4th or 5th grade, are extroverts. And extroverts typically would like everybody to be an extrovert. Well, a lot of the children that we deal with are in fact introverts. And they like time to reflect, and they like time to create, and they are likely to more withdraw from a situation than upset people, because they're also very often feelers, which means they have a sort of sense of not wanting to hurt, not wanting to put their teachers in a bad light. They try and observe what they're supposed to do, but you know, when they're expected to do things which really they'd like to give some time to, like writing stories or doing an independent study, typically the teacher's going to say, no, you can't do that now. You've got to do this, got to do that. And so that's where they're boring, because in terms of iterations, as you well know, Tasia, is that these children that we're talking about so often are able to get it in 1 or 2 iterations, compared to their peers. Perfectly normal, healthy young people may need it repeated 5, 6, 7, 8 or more times. Well, while that's happening, this child has therefore time to do something else, but they may not be able to do that. And so, for instance, I've observed young people, 2 young people I remember clearly, trying to get their sharp pencil through a mathematical book. And that is how they spent their time. Every time they had a math lesson, out come the sharp pencil. And I watched one boy actually look excited because he found his pencil had come through the book, while the teacher was actually teaching, you know, some small thing that had been learned perhaps, you know, months before. But it's those sorts of things that mums and dads come and report, and so it begins to uncover what is going on in the classroom. And once you begin to uncover what goes on in the classroom, you can begin to sort of look at ways in which we could perhaps overcome such issues. So, for instance, I used Renzuli's Scripsis which is scales of rating behavior of superior students. I'm not sure I exactly like the title, but nevertheless, it serves its purpose, because I think in Europe, they only use a few of those categories, but in America, I think it's 14. And that's terrific, because what you're beginning to get is actual information of how these children are perceived to be performing by their teachers. It's not my information. It's not mum and dad's information. It's their own information. So you can say, when you get that information, well, look, here's the strengths. Let's see if we can use those strengths, because if those strengths are involved in what's happening on a day-to-day basis, then what you're going to actually increase is a child's sense of satisfaction. You're going to employ his or her own agency in learning. And altogether, you're going to have a child that is motivated and engaged in day-to-day work. I had one girl who one of the teachers was insisting on her doing second and third grade math, for instance, when in point of fact, she was quite capable of doing 13-year-old math. And so she actually suffered from psychosomatic illness at the beginning of a semester during tests, because she was so upset that she was having to repeat stuff that she'd learned in kindergarten. So, you begin to get a picture that you can share with the teachers and say, look, here's a child who actually could be of benefit to your whole class by perhaps initiating some sort of interesting process, independent studies, some sort of presentation that may be helpful to the whole group. There are ways of overcoming this. The other thing that I find very useful to take a look at is actually the resilience that a child has, and what is perceived. Where are they strong? What are their strengths? Are they responsible? And if that ties in with something that you and I know of as executive function, if you tie in the resilience with an ability to look after their desks, manage their tasks, organize their studies, then there is a way then of totally overcoming those issues that the child is ultimately coming to see me about. You can solve it along with the child. And I've had that happen a number of times over the last 20 years. And that's very wonderful, because parents then come and say, what a remarkable change. And I've had teachers say, wow, I didn't know the child could do that. And so it becomes a positive or win-win sort of situation. Now, Tassio, you'll have to tell me where to start again, because I got so involved. Where would you like me to go from there?
Yeah, it is very interesting, because really we would like to know like a number of cases you managed to find out and to solve their problems.
Well, over the last two decades, I have completed getting on for, I think it's 200 personality tests.
Amazing.
Now, that may not sound a lot of children, but when you multiply that by parents and the number of teachers, then it actually indicates the number of people who are affected by knowing what the personality is, ways in which dealing with introverted child as opposed to other sort of character types. Because in my clinic, I've found, I think it's something like 65% of young people coming to visit are in fact introverted. You know, kids who want to reflect, kids who want to give time to something, kids who really are interested in you know, making a good job, not trying to be difficult, not deliberately behaviorally sort of a problem. They just want to use their skills and would like some time to do that. So there's getting on for 200 at least young people. I think quite a large number of examples come to mind. I'm not sure we have time to do a great number, but the majority of parents who have seen me don't always come back. And it's not because they haven't found some help, is that they become advocates for their own child and help the child to realize his or her own agency in working and learning and growing and developing. So I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen every child's parents perhaps for years. And then I suddenly get an email from one of the children, for instance. And there's one child who particularly is indicative of what happens after this process, is that they feel so energized and motivated that they suddenly begin to develop, especially if they have the support from the teachers and others that are working with them, perhaps counselors or psychologists, suddenly find their feet. Suddenly they become quite different. And that may sound like an exaggeration when I say suddenly, but it can be sudden as soon as they can see something different. So I've had a number of children and young people now getting back to me who are now in college and university or in very, very responsible positions in society, where they're suddenly able to use, or they suddenly realize that their talents that were at one time almost a nuisance to them and certainly an irritation to the teachers are actually huge examples of the capital, the human capital that they represent in terms of what they're able to do and what they're able to contribute. One boy I remember very well, very, very well. This was actually before I studied with Renzulli in Yukon. It was not long before I attended the National Research Center for Gifted and Talented, but this young man was supposed to be in 5th grade doing math and various things like that for 45 minutes in the mornings. The 5th grade teacher came up to me and she said, "Trevor," she said, "there's nothing I can teach this young man. What can you do to help?" So I went across to the local college. I found that the young man was very able at working with computers. And the teacher I found at the local college was very, very excited to teach him poetry after school or work with poetry. So the 5th grade teacher and the parents were willing to let this happen. It was an unusual sort of transition of a child being out of 5th grade, suddenly being able to sort of work with, I think it was C or Q or something, some coding issue with computer. I'm not that au fait with computer work, but I know that he was able to design games on computers and so on and so forth in 5th grade. Well, I think it was about 12, 15 years after, that young man is now a leading physician in a medical field designing machines that are capable of actually helping other medics work out both what is a serious problem with a client and ways in which it can be overcome. Well, I wonder what would have happened to that young man. I mean, he probably still would have been successful. However, I've often wondered what would have happened if he'd have been caused to stay for almost a year, wasting 45 minutes each morning of school, doing something he was already able to do. You know, and that's often the question, you know, what is the alternative? What happens if we're not going to move these children forward or give them an opportunity to learn? So I'm very conscious of what we're doing is really important. It isn't just sort of working with the parents and, you know, earning some money. I find it very difficult to equate money with the needs of the children, to be honest. I find it very disturbing that parents, for instance, can't actually get help financially from insurance companies just because their child is highly able and not disabled. I think that's unfair, actually, but that's how it is, and that's how we have to go ahead. I don't know whether that answers your question, Tasia, but I can multiply that many times.
Yeah, this is really a very good answer. And as we see, you already contributed to the lives and success of many people.
Yeah, I do think I have. And I don't want this to sound too boastful, but in a sense, and I have to thank my wife for this, she says, Trevor, you very often feel you're not doing your best, because I think you and I know that our motivation is not for our own prestige. It's very much a humanitarian thing. We want to see these children, and especially at my age now, I want to see them in the world making a difference. And yet at times I think, oh my goodness, I don't think I did well enough to help this child understand, or the parents or the teachers, especially when the teachers get angry with me because I'm putting something forward that they just don't like. There's a little story, I'll tell you about that in a moment. But my wife has said, Trevor, isn't it a bit like taking a tumor out of the child's brain? Isn't it like making them healthy, but in a totally different way than normally is perceived to be the way? And I think that's that is true. I mean, going back to this young man, Tim, what would he have been like? What would his sense of self be if he had been expected to sit there and metaphorically go through ABC when he learned that, you know, almost when he was 3? He was ready to do something entirely different. And so in a sense, I do see it helpful. Metaphorically, I think it is like mending some part of the body or removing something that's, you know, getting in the way of your development. So yes, I think that's part
And what
of
about the most serious problems when it
Well,
comes, you know, to the gifted population?
well, give me an example, because I probably have one, but you tell me one that, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, for example, you think they are not able to fit in the classroom, they are targeted by other people in the form of bullying, they are depressed because they are not able to communicate with teachers. For example, sometimes he or she is not getting enough support from the family or from the school teacher, you know, something like this.
Yeah. And they are serious, and very often they do take that form, and it does take a lot of energy. First of all, um, and I think this is really important part of holistic assessment, Tasia, because you're not just looking at a number and saying the kid's gifted, because that doesn't actually give you any avenues to explore. I think having the holistic assessment, it gives you a number of avenues you can to explore and see where the strengths are. Because, you know, if you can pinpoint where the strengths are, it is definitely an insight into where there may be a solution to the problem. That doesn't mean to say you ignore the weaknesses, because I'm absolute fervent believer that through our strengths we can overcome our weaknesses. So strengths. Now, it's funny because this morning, before we set out on this conversation, the young man that I told you about who came to visit me because he was thinking of committing suicide, which was panic for his mother, of course, who brought him. I've known him since kindergarten. So there's getting on for 10 years I've known this young man, and he's done some remarkable things. Well, in our conversation, he said that one of his strengths was, or one of his wishes was to go to MIT in America, in technology, the Institute of Technology, as a mechanical engineer. And before I came, before this meeting, I just wrote an email to him because he said, I'd asked him for his interests, and we went in a little deeper into his interests this morning. And he said, well, I am very interested in mechanical engineering. And I said to him, well, have you looked at journals? Because one of the things that's boring him is that he goes to school and he's given no work. And because of the virus, he's just sitting doing nothing, waiting to catch the bus home. I said, well, look, you know, if you've got a problem, excuse me.
Call from.
If you've got a problem with time wasting, then it's up to you. Use your own agency and your fascination with this and that, and take a look at what your interest is. I said, have you looked at any journals about mechanical engineering? I said, because when I was honors, one of the assistants in the honors program at University of Connecticut, I found that young people who had done research in the field of their interest, who then applied for university, actually did well in their interviews because they knew professors, they knew issues, they were aware of articles, they'd done some research about things that they were interested in. I've had a number, for instance, who are interested in astrophysics and things of that nature. And I've done the same sort of recommendation with them, is that I said, well, you know, use that time, turn it around so it isn't wasted, but actually used. I said, go find some books and journals and subscribe to MIT Journal, for instance, and there is such a thing. Subscribe to it, get it, put it in your backpack, and be thankful that you've got an issue, a time. He's actually introverted as well, by the way, in personality, and loves to be quiet. And actually, he doesn't mind being isolated. It's having nothing to do that is a problem to him. I said, use that time so that when you go to your interview, as I suspect you will, in some, maybe even at MIT, you will already have knowledge of the professors that work there. You will already have knowledge of issues that they're looking at. things that you may actually be interested in joining in with projects and other research. I said, then the time isn't wasted. And I said, believe me, once your mind is active, you'll think, where the heck did the day go? You know, where was the time? And he said, okay, so now I'm waiting for an email to see whether he's actually going to do that. But I think if he does, this incident may actually turn out to be precious as opposed to an issue of failure. Because these kids don't want to fail. You know, they actually want to succeed. And that's often a problem, even with little ones. They want to succeed. And so it's a real sadness to them. Sometimes they can't articulate the sadness, but there's a sadness inside them that they're not doing what they really need to do.
What I like, about your approach, that you make a combination between career counseling and guidance, and also you offer the right support, because you offer them the support to try to solve their emotional or social problems. In addition to that, you are offering, I can say, the right career counseling.
Yeah, if they have shared it with me in the discussion, but even if it comes via the teacher through Scripsis or some other means. So for instance, I do the Torrance test of creativity at the moment. I know there's EPOC, but TTCT is useful in that I can do it in a day. So I also look at their creativity levels. And if you connect that with their interests, if you connect that with material that you get from cognitive ability tests like visual skills or verbal skills, you can begin to sort of thread some sort of pyramid that allows you to see where they can go. And, you know, it allows you to take a look at things not from just a number. I was only just writing Kurt Heller's piece. Advice is if we think we only can get to know with gifted children by a number, we're wrong. Kaufman said the same. Sternberg says the same. I mean, these people who I have enormous respect for, and I know you do also, people who have done a massive research into these children, certainly more than I have. It's self-evident that these children are made up of a complex puzzle of different aspects. And I don't know whether you feel this, but if I lose a puzzle piece, that's enormously frustrating. You know, if I've got a puzzle, I want to find all the bits. And I think that's really a nice, I don't know whether I think it's a metaphor for what we do. Is they are puzzling. They are complex human beings, but there are ways in finding where the puzzle pieces are. Mm. And then in answer to your original question, what do you do with difficult cases? It has often come to me that once you get the pieces, it's not quite so difficult as you thought it was, because you're beginning to shed the light on elements that aren't normally thought of as being potential avenues towards their strengths and capabilities and proclivities and whatever. And I think that also goes, I mean, once you do Dabrowski's intensities and all those sorts of things and begin to link it up, they're all parts of that puzzle. And you know, and I know, is that's not part of, it's not something that teachers have time or training or opportunity to actually look at. Mm-hmm. Psychologists, I think, especially if they're not involved day to day with disabilities, might have more time to take a look at what is the components of ability that I can look at that make a difference to this job. I don't know whether that answered your question, but
Yes. And do you think, based on your experience, Trevor, is there any difference between the number of male students in comparison, or yes, in contrast with, for example, the number of female gifted students who try to find or to get guidance, counseling, and some help and support? I
that's a
mean, did
very,
you find it that the number of girls may be less than the number of boys, or it is the other way?
that's a very good question. And if I looked at my material that's on the computer, I could be able to tell you, because I've got the whole list of young people that I've done the personality test. I've also got all their reports. I don't have the right number in my mind at this moment in time, because there's definitely a difference between gifted female and gifted male. But you know, it's interesting because there is the personality of gender personality doesn't really make a huge difference. They're both equally reflective, both equally sensitive, both equally demanding of time and energy or opportunity to reflect on what they're doing. However, there is definitely a certain femininity about girls, and we know that the imposter syndrome is a clear issue. So, for instance, if there's a male in the family, a son, it can be very often it's the female that backs down to some degree, unless she has a particularly strong mother, you know, who doesn't allow that to happen and say, look, you know, you're no different. But there is a femininity, I think, of backing down and not wishing to be seen as disturbance. However, I have had young women who have come to me who are, I would say, equally a pain to teachers because they express their irritation in different ways, and can be quite as expressive as any young man. Having said that, one or two of the people that young women that I've worked with are interested in, they often like working with younger kids. So if, for instance, they're having a problem in a class and they're finishing off work, they may have a inclination to go and work with the grade below them or in preschool or something of that nature, which the boys probably wouldn't do. I mean, there are differences. It's a great question though, Tassir, and I would like to examine that a little more, but I definitely have noticed the differences.
Knowing that you have international connection and you have, or you are still in contact with different cultures and different countries, did you find any differences between students who have some social emotional problems in the US in comparison with other cultures? Or we can say there are differences associated or related to cultural background or any other, source for diversity?
That is another great question. First, I must answer it because I'm only allowed to do real clinical work working with the children in Vermont. That's because of licensing, and it's just the law. So children that come to see me from different places may very well come from New England or somewhere in North America, And so in answer to your question with respect to countries abroad, it's mostly anecdotal material that I receive. I'm definitely asked because people know what I do. And some of the things that I'm able to do can be done online. And I've had a number of things, for instance, sent to me from various places. For instance, I've just not long had a request for personality, working out what a personality of a particular child is. And I've been able to send that out because it's not me, it's more of a text that can be used by others elsewhere. And then it's sent back to me and I'm able then to interpret it or whatever. And I've had material from Poland, I've had material from Switzerland, I've had material from Germany, and I'm working with a professor in Slovenia, and another professor in Turkey. So I'm getting anecdotal material from different countries, which leads me to believe that we are all one human race. And it's interesting because in part, a piece of research that I'm doing at the moment is looking at exactly that question. Are we in fact one body of humanity with all the functions and difficulties and that we all experience? I mean, that's a really, really deep question. And it's a fascinating one. And ultimately, I'm inclined to think we are certainly susceptible to many, many things that are no different in Iceland than they are in New Zealand Maoris or, you know, other folks in different cultures. And I've also accepted that we have to be careful of the context, because I think that's what you're looking at. That's what the question is about, is what is the context of what we're doing as a body of people trying to look at what we can do to make change in the world. Context is important. And I think culture is bound to make a difference. I mean, I'm certainly not in any way denigrating German thinking, for instance, but it tends to be based on the education that people received over the years. England was somewhat different. It was, when I was being taught to be a teacher, it was much freer and much more sort of open-ended. It was a little more abstract, whereas some cultures are particularly concrete. And where there's concrete, you've also got a lack of risk taking. If it's abstract, there's more risk taking. And that all applies to how kids are perceived and how they're educated. Although it was really interesting, and I think you may read this at some point in time, but I had some work from a couple of researchers in the Philippines, and they had come in touch with a group of people that are living, as we speak, in the highlands of the Philippines. And it's a group of people who are thought to have been established and rooted in that part when the Spanish, 400 or 500 years ago, went into the Philippines. And they did some research and found that, in fact, giftedness was somewhat alien to their thinking, in that it was only something that was the possession of elders. And the researchers also intimated that the children, therefore, would not think of themselves as being possibly gifted, because it was the prerogative of elders, which is quite different. in terms of how you view giftedness. So there are these anomalies out there. I think we really do have to be concerned with the context, because what we provide, what you provide probably as well as I do, is much Western in terms of its perceptions. I think we have to step beyond that and be very much aware of context. So not assume that this or that. I know, for instance, in Germany, as we speak, and I think you know the situation, there are those that still think that the number is it. And if you don't reach that number, then it ain't it. You know, 129.999 is not gifted, whereas 130 is. Well, you know, I think Kaufman had a great deal to talk about that. He said it's just not, well, he used certain terminology, but I'll just say it just doesn't sit right. It cannot be true. Renzulli's more liberal view, I tend to sort of think of as being really very valuable, in that it gives you a bit of a leeway to look at the creativity piece. I'm inclined to look at other issues, not just creativity, but sensibilities, moral conscience, you know, various aspects that are not numerical. They're more sort of to do with the psychology as opposed to the numeracy of giftedness.
And what is your recommendation for, we can say, new teachers and those who already spent a large number or a number of years in this profession, when it comes, you know, how to deal with the gifted, how to handle their social emotional problems, and, you know, similar things?
Well, you asked some great questions. It just so happened that on Saturday, this past Saturday, I took part in a Zoom meeting with parents who are very much involved with highly able individuals. Most of them are homeschooling, but not all. Some are engaged with schools in various ways. But one of the homeschool teachers, or one of the homeschool parents, admitted to being basically rushing away from school as an educator to just take care of their child at home. And it was fascinating to hear her say, she said, this is so different, because she said, I'm used to 28 children or more doing what I require them to do according to a schedule, and I expect so much to be done in a particular day. And then there's homework to make sure that it's nicely repeated. And she said, this is so wonderful that I don't have to do this with the child. She said, I suddenly realized, in fact, she said, I feel actually guilty that I'm not engaged every moment of the day with my child. So that really takes me a long time to get into a different way of working. And I think that really is a good example, because I think it goes back to that concrete thing and abstract thing, is that teachers are paid to do a certain job. They're trained to do a certain job. And it's definitely to do with organization, rigidity in certain ways. And if someone steps out of bounds, then there's a problem. And you also have the problem of, well, does it, you know, what about GPA, grade point average, and things that are concrete. My own grandchild is suffering from that, because she needs to step out of that type of concrete, because she's an abstract thinker. My sense is, and this is my experience, is that older teachers can be either. I think it depends on their personality as to how they can deal with the children. Most teachers, in my experience, and maybe you can help me in this, but I believe something like 85% of teachers, at least in America, in the younger grade school, elementary school, are they're extroverts, and they tend to be rather sort of detail oriented. And so that's how they deal with their day. And in many cases, that's perfectly fine, until you come to this aberration called a gifted kid who's introverted. So, but I've seen both. I don't often see many introverted, more reflective educators, except the art teachers and the music teachers and the teachers who are dealing with abstractions and creativity. They tend to be different. And I found it really interesting because it goes back to my dissertation way back 20 years ago, which we looked at, and you know about, that self-efficacy of teachers towards teaching higher order thinking skills. What I found was that math teachers, people who deal with science, deal with precision, deal with concrete ideas, are the less risk-taking and therefore more they more emphasize the way that you have to do things excuse me, in terms of analysis or calculation and so on. I found that the teachers who were more self-efficacious were those who were willing to take a risk. And they were often the English writers, the creative writers, the artists, and so on and so forth. So there are differences over and above the fact that age makes a difference also. Young people who I've felt have had experience with and who I've taught in preparation for their teaching are not so adventurous. They're nervous. And I have sat observing teachers in schools where you can tell they're not quite sure, so therefore they stick exactly to the rules. I remember one occasion where I was observing teachers in Massachusetts, and they had to post exactly what they were going to be doing day to day in a box outside their door. And every now and again, either the principal or the superintendent would come along, take out what they're supposed to be doing, walk into the classroom and see whether in fact they were doing what they'd written on this paper. I think that's when I left teaching teachers because it was so against how I felt that A, they should teach, and B, how the children should learn. If it was all prescribed, almost with a play, some organized piece of writing, scripted writing. I just don't feel that that is how we teach generally, but particularly it's not the way we teach. I think more open-ended, highly able, sensitive, creative young people that you and I know.
My question before the last one.
Oh, really? Did I forget this?
Yeah, we can take as long as you can, but it is really very interesting. What do you think about the impact of digitization and all these pandemic crisis, or this, the impact of pandemic and digitization, distance learning, and so on? What do you think about the impact of all these factors?
Well, being a granddad with 4 grandchildren, that has come to be a family matter. I have my youngest grandson has been taken into homeschool by my daughter because he just is not that sort of person who likes to, I mean, he doesn't despise stuff through online. However, he does like to do other things besides. And only yesterday, my wife and I went to visit, and he showed me all the sort of things he's doing, like wood carving and, you know, making things. And that is hard to do when you're looking at a screen. It may be okay as an initiator, but for it to actually be the whole educational piece, I think for him and others I know, I think it's actually more detrimental. And that's the news that I'm constantly listening to, because I'm aware of it, not only from my grandchildren, but from folks around the local news, how some children succeed, some children don't with these things. My other grandchild, the younger one's sister, she's got now access to a camera, film camera, and so she's doing a hybrid where she's going into school doing online, sometimes distancing with the teacher on certain ways when there's plenty of space to do it. She's enjoying that piece for 2 days a week, but then she's beginning to make her projects, and she's interviewing people in the town and making films of these interviews and so on and so forth. And she's finding that a beautiful moment of being herself. And that makes it a balance. And where we live, we're very lucky to have those sorts of opportunities. Not everybody, we're very aware that not everybody has that. My eldest grandson, he's doing hybrid. No, I apologize. He's doing full online. The latest I heard is that he absolutely hates it. Partly because the difference in the teachers delivering it. One is using that technology well, in a sort of creative way. The other one is using it in a sort of almost martial way. It's this or no way, and the homework has to be this and that, and that he finds hard. He feels more comfortable with the teachers who are a little bit abstract, a little bit sort of open to ideas, listening to the child, as opposed to telling the child. My eldest granddaughter, she's graduating from school very early, came into a situation where it was all online, but having talked to the teachers and looking at using her own energy and agency, she's described to the teachers the sort of things she would love to do. And one of the things is preparing to teach in Italy and Austria. You know, so she's now beginning to sort of look at ways in which she can prepare herself for that. Well, I think that's and the teachers have agreed. But that says a lot about teachers, and I also recognize that even schools in next towns don't have the teachers who are willing to go beyond what they feel is absolutely necessary in their delivery. And my sense is, from what I've heard on the news, is that children are actually beginning to fall out of that situation and not necessarily enjoy the online as much as they may have done in the past. And I think this is really indicative for you and I and people like us that this is a time of change. we have to make some differences in this situation. And I just this morning had a report from UNICEF. 420 million children in the world, something like that. And I haven't looked through all the data, but it's looking at, you know, how many of those, what percentage of that children have access to things like online. And the majority don't. It's only in countries where there is some largesse, there is some sort of capital, some sort of opportunity for kids to get online. But there are so many who are going to suffer from this. And I think there's a general sense that this could be a good time or it could be a disaster. And I would like to feel, and I know you feel this way, is that if we can make a difference to a certain group of individuals, then we've done our bit. Does this make sense, Tassia?
Yeah, and I am really thankful for your answers and contributions, taking into consideration that this is our first meeting, but it will not be the last. I would like to thank you for this meeting and to enable us to communicate and discuss with you very important issues. But before we leave this meeting, I know that you are doing a number of, or you are working on a number of projects and initiatives. So will you please give us some information about your current projects and initiatives and what you are thinking about for the future? And this will be covered and highlighted in the coming meetings with you.
Okay. Well, the one that I was working at until you contacted me this morning is really looking at the partnership between pedagogy and psychology and the need for those two elements that come together to make gifted education, how it needs both those elements to be equal standing. I don't think teachers, without considering the feelings and the strengths and the needs of our children, any child, never mind about what their level of giftedness is, I don't think without giving a real attention to that leads to satisfactory education. One of the pieces I wrote for the journals, I always get mixed up, but the International Journal of Talent Development and Creativity was entitled Murdering of the Innocents. And I likened it to Dickens' story in Hard Times, where you're looking at the comparison between a child who learns about horses because her father looks after horses, and a child in the class who has not a whit of an idea of what a horse is, but he knows it's got teeth, 4 legs, and it's called a horse. You know, and the teacher in Hard Times, Gradgrind, totally accepted the guy's explanation about this animal that has 4 legs and 40 teeth or something, but dismissed Sissy's answer because it was more feeling and it was more sort of sensitive and it was more of an insight as to what this creature, a horse, was called. And my sense is that if more teachers, more psychologists went towards strengths, for instance, as opposed to what are perceived as weaknesses or deficits, and look for ways in which, yes, we all have a deficit. I mean, I know I have a deficit. You know you have a deficit. But if we prevaricate on that, then we might easily dismiss the strengths, which actually could be something that is profitable, beneficial, both to ourselves and to the community, our families, and so on, and even to the world. I often think of Greta Thunberg, you know, who was dismissed very rudely by one of the leaders in this country as just being an angry young woman. And yet she could actually be a prophet, depending on how you view. And so what I'm looking at is ways in which we could have some support from those who are totally dedicated to looking after the what might be perceived as failing issues, and that might include both psychologists and teachers. But I would like to see that we somehow combine a new view as to what education is about. So I'm just looking at how, you know, what can be expected if we bring those two things together, and what we might lose if we don't. So that's what I'm working on. It's really fascinating, because typically, as you probably know, is that people in our field tend to work in their silos, and they talk a lot to people who are using the same silo, but maybe dismiss those who are working on similar things, but in some other silo. And I think there ought to be a shared conversation, a shared understanding that if we can bring our thoughts together and see where the strengths merge, then that is likely to be of great help to humanity. It goes back a little bit, and I should finish here, is that, you know, the term rubric. One of the ways in which I help, I think, teachers to help our children is to allow them to share the rubric. So the rubric is not something that is placed, but a rubric is something that is designed together. Because what you're asking for is responsibility and buy-in. And I think if these children, particularly now focusing on our particular population, if our children are asked and invited to share their thoughts, I think the whole of humanity can benefit from that. And I think Sternberg and Don Ambrose, who we both know, they're talking about wise, being wise, and looking at those issues. I just think that we do need to be wise, and wisdom is to do with sharing, I think.
Thank you so much, Trevor. And I think also we will address another topic in the coming interviews, especially your system, which is called Chandelier, and as a comprehensive and holistic approach to do identification and to produce a comprehensive profile. And based on that profile, we can offer services or integrated, services meant to help the gifted students in different age groups.
That sounds exciting, Tassia. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.